moving on, I want to take this opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Several months ago, I was at a meeting in Florida for the American Beverage Institute, and I heard Garrett Peck speak there. Garrett is an author of a couple of books, one called A Prohibition Hangover, Alcohol in America, from Demon Rum to Colt Cabernet, and also Prohibition, Washington, D.C., How Dry We Weren't. And I'm a history guy. I like my history, and I thought that Garrett really brought up a lot of interesting things, interesting facts, interesting ideas about Prohibition and how it affects our industry and how it affects our industry even today. Even though Prohibition ended for the most part in 1933, we still have what Garrett calls a Prohibition hangover. And I think Garrett will point out how things had happened in that time frame from 1919 to 1932, 1933, and then the repeal of it. And we thought, oh, Prohibition is dead and gone. It is not dead. We talk about many times on this very format about the neo-prohibitionists and all of the groups and all of the people that want to put us out of business and how they have demonized the product that we all sell in a legal manner. And Garrett really points out how this thing came about and where it's going. And he does it in a very, very interesting and factual manner. So with that, I want to introduce author Garrett Peck to talk about Prohibition, then and now, and where we're headed. So let's give a welcome to Garrett Peck.
I really appreciate the hospitality everyone has shown me here. I arrived yesterday, and people just embraced me. It was so nice meeting so many different people here yesterday. And also really wanted to say thank you here so much to Pete. Pete and I met back in the spring. And so I really appreciate him inviting me here today. And hopefully this will be both informational and hopefully also entertaining as well. So my background, get quicker. Again, my background, Pete introduced me here, but I started researching Prohibition probably almost 10 years ago or so. I come from a Methodist background, and the Methodists were once the leading church involved in the temperance movement. Now you look at today, and most Methodists now drink. Right? So one year at Christmas in 2003, I bought a bottle of wine to my grandmother's place for dinner, and there were three of us at the table: my grandmother, my mom, and myself. And my grandmother just got this little look in her eye. She got a little bit snooty about the fact that I bought that bottle of wine, you know. And that was like the light bulb moment. I thought, gosh, what happened here? How did this generational value, you know, where she really poo-pooed drinking, not get transferred on to my mom and to myself? And at that point, I thought, there's an idea here. Let me go research this. So, along the way, I started leading this, you know, I became a real dork. I started leading this historical tour called the Temperance Tour of Prohibition sites in Washington, D.C. I live in Northern Virginia here, by the way. And that is, by the way, that's our temperance fountain. There's a guy named Henry Cogswell who, in the 1880s, erected about 50 of these around the country. This was all part of this big culture war against alcohol in the country. So it was all about trying to get people to drink water instead of whiskey. So you see all the water symbolism on there. And I ended up here writing two different books. So The Prohibition Hangover, as Pete talked about, and that's a very serious book about how Americans drink and, you know, what are the contemporary issues. And then this other one here, which is about Prohibition in Washington, D.C., which is not just about D.C., but rather about the national fight against alcohol. So we were supposed to be, D.C. was supposed to be the model dry city again for the country. We ended up with 3,000 speakeasies and about 4,500 bootleggers, and even Congress had its own bootleggers and they employed. So, pretty remarkable here that how quickly Prohibition really came undone. This was going to be was really going to change the world, and, you know, 14 years later, we changed the Constitution back. You know, kind of crazy. So what I want to kind of frame the whole argument about is how did we get from there to where we are now? So how did we get from these lovely ladies here, probably from the 1890s, who, you know, say, lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours, to the point where we are today, where most people now drink. You look at these women here, and they're painting a picture of heavy stigma against alcohol, which is what my grandmother grew up with. You know, when she died a couple of years ago, and when we were to her house. She always insisted that she didn't drink, but there in the in the kitchen, we found deep behind one of the cupboards a very small bar that she had. And we were all like, oh my gosh, she actually did drink, you know. But she was part of a generation, she was born in 1913, that was raised with the stigma against alcohol. That if you shouldn't be drinking, right, was the message that she heard. But if you do drink, don't let anyone see you, right? That was the message that her generation grew up with. Here I am, I'm a Generation Xer. It's hard to find anyone my age or beyond who doesn't drink. It's just kind of how we socialize, it's just part of our culture now, right? I mean, they say alcohol has always really been part of American culture. But for this brief period where we heavily stigmatized it, and not just stigmatized it, but changed the Constitution to ban the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages, is really a strange anomaly in American history, you know, that had to do this. So you see, I'll throw a couple slides up here. I think this is really fascinating. This is not meant to be academic or anything. These are slides here from Gallup. I like Gallup a lot because they don't have a stake in the fight. They're just there to find information and find out about what Americans think about particular topics. So you'll see for right here, Gallup has done this survey almost every year since 1939. And this shows you how Americans drink. And it's been, you see there's been a couple little bumps along the way, but what Gallup points out is that about 2/3 of American adults drink alcohol. It's pretty remarkable. And this has been pretty consistent since 1939, the first year they took that. This is from the 2010 survey, and you can see the 2011 and 2012 right there. Consistent as well. Most of us drink. It's just part of our normal culture. It's part of our lifestyle. It's how we socialize. You know, it's not just something that we do, but it's something that brings communities together. You know, hence people go out to taverns. You know, everybody gets to stay at home and drink, right? They like getting together with their friends and their family members and drinking together socially, watching sporting events and so on. So, I will point out here throughout this there's some other key findings that are interesting. This kind of lays out here kind of the culture of how we drink and who drinks. So you'll see here, for example, the younger that you are, the more likely you are to drink. You see across the top there, 55 and older. And I think that's partly because of the people like my grandmother of that era that were still kind of taught that alcohol is sinful and that you shouldn't be drinking. And then you fast forward to later generations and we don't think anything of it, right? It's just part of our culture. The more educated you are, the more you are likely to drink, and the more Catholic you are as well. Also more likely to drink. You think about the temperance movement, and this is going to be like, oh yeah, duh. The temperance movement was a faith-based initiative led by evangelical Protestant churches, right? They're the ones who stigmatized alcohol and pushed this onto the country. So, yeah, just kind of think about that. When you look across the bottom there, where you see fourth one up from the very bottom, we see Protestants still have the lowest drinking rates across the country. And also, if you make more money, you're also more likely to drink too. All right, what do we like to drink? This is interesting. Gallup started asking this poll back in 1992, so it's only 20 years old. They did not go back all the way back to World War II like the earlier data. But it shows you that beer is still our favorite beverage, but is in kind of a long-term decline as wine and distilled spirits pop up. And you guys might see that across your bars here. People have more variety, they have more choices now than we've ever had in American history, you know? You think about the wholesalers coming to you and say, hey, try this new thing, right? It's astonishing the number of products that are out there now versus even 20 years ago where you might have had just a few things to sell. Now you have a lot more cocktails that people want to try and so on. So again, beer and wine and liquor, they're in a bit of a tug of war, and wine has really popped up here over the last couple of decades. So one interesting thing here about the demographics of how we drink here, there's definitely a Venus versus Mars kind of thing going on. Men definitely are beer drinkers, and I fit in that category right there. That's my preferred drink. Whereas women tend to prefer wine. And it's kind of an interesting phenomenon, I think. Which probably goes back decades. I think among many women, there's still kind of this sense of that beer is a man's drink, right? And that beer somehow is fattening. Even though it's not, right? I mean, a calorie is a calorie. A serving of alcohol largely has the same amount of calories. You know, and yet there's this, I think, a bit of a stigma against beer from part of the population. Again, women tend to prefer wine over beer, and yet both sexes equally like cocktails. So that kind of gives us a sense here of how Americans drink, where we are. You get a sense here across our culture that alcohol really is much more considered to be a normal consumer product that most of us now drink, and that the stigma has largely worn off, and yet in some places it still really exists. You've seen, I think, largely looking at how Prohibition unfolded, how it unwound, that this stigma against alcohol still really existed for several decades afterwards, and in some ways it's really transformed into the public health advocacy. So, which is not necessarily about getting people to stop drinking, but rather about trying to get people to drink at home more, about creating laws that are about public safety that influence how and where people drink alcohol. So, you think about your organization and the effect that you guys have. When was the Tavern League formed? 1935, exactly, right? When did Prohibition end? 1933, right? Is this a coincidence? No, it's not. No. There's a reason you guys formed, right? Which was in 1933, there was this still very strong stigma. The group that gave us Prohibition was called the Anti-Saloon League. If that gives you any sense, right? So there was still a very, very strong movement against alcohol in the country, and many people still expected the temperance movement to have another stab at Prohibition. You know, people were expecting possibly the Constitution to be changed again. Fortunately, that did not take place. You know, and we kind of moved on from the issue of World War II and so on. But yeah, there's still this movement that alcohol is a problem and we need to deal with it. And you know, it used to be let's teach it from the pulpit, people stop drinking, and we changed the Constitution. And now it's let's put public health systems in place which are going to reduce the ability of people to drink and ultimately force people to drink more and more at home as opposed to out at bars. So talking about that legacy of Prohibition, some of the things that come about, I live in Northern Virginia, right? So you'll see that store right there, that's my liquor store, which looks very much like something you'd see in the Soviet Union. Because I'm part of one of those 18 states that became control states after Prohibition ended. Wisconsin is a licensed state, which is the majority of the states. The green states are the licensed jurisdictions. And there's been a movement afoot nationwide among those 18 states to privatize, to move over towards a licensed jurisdiction. My state, Virginia, tried to do that, and ultimately it was about revenue, and they declined to privatize the system. But Washington State, Ohio, West Virginia, they've all taken steps here toward privatization. But yeah, you fundamentally have to ask that question: what is the state's role in liquor? Is it to regulate it, or is it to sell it? You know, we ask that all the time, especially when you go to one of these crappy liquor stores. That you can just go across the border to Washington D.C. or to Maryland and have a better retail experience, and so on. So it also impacts liquor store owners, bar owners, because they have to buy the liquor from the state, and there's no discount. You buy it, and we have higher liquor costs here. You see, who remembers blue laws? Not too many hands are going up. Wow. Blue laws were these laws pushed by Sabbatarians, those people who believe that we need to respect Sunday as the Lord's Day, and therefore all business needs to stop, including selling alcohol and drinking of alcohol. That is one of those things that's just sort of fallen by the wayside as consumers have shifted since the 1930s. You know, we have two-income families now, so people need to do their shopping on the weekends, right? So Saturday is the big shopping day, and by Sunday. You know, people demand to have these freedoms. And initially, when Prohibition ended, part of the deal, alcohol had never really been regulated much before. It taxed, but it wasn't regulated. So part of the promise of repeal in 1933 was that we were going to heavily regulate alcohol, including the social environment under which people could drink, right? So some of you may remember, even all the way back to the 1960s, part of the environment of drinking was, if you were at a bar, you had to actually be in a seat at the bar. You think about that happy hour we had last night, where we're all networking, and we all had a beer in our hand and a business card in the other. You couldn't do that right after Prohibition. You know, part of the environment was, if you were drinking in a bar, you had to have your butt in a seat, and if you wanted to move to another table and so on, the bartender had to come along and pick up your bar and carry it for you. Consumers were no against that, right? So consumers decided that's inconvenient. We want more freedom, and therefore we have these happy hours now where we can stand and talk around and carry your drink with you and so on. So again, this is consumers in action, right? We demand more freedoms. And as a result, so many of the laws that were put in place in 1933, 1934 have ended up with a lot of really awkward compromises over the years as people have demanded more freedom to drink in different circumstances and so on. So, but we still have a lot of these old laws still in the books that really date to 1934 where no one can really explain them anymore. One of the things I noticed in the Prohibition hangover when I was going around exploring and interviewing a lot of people involved in the trade was how much the craft environment has really picked up. And you don't just see this here, this is obviously Sam Adams, but they're the biggest craft brewer out there now. But you see this not just in beer, but you also see it with wine and distilled spirits, that Americans have been far more willing to drink better products now, right? They probably put a little bit of a crimp since the recession. People are less willing to spend $60 on a bottle of bourbon now than they were 4 or 5 years ago. But still, I think fundamentally our habits have changed. The fact that people are more concerned with what they're drinking, they want stuff that actually tastes better and so on. And as a result, there's also been this big tourism industry that's popped up. So has anybody been out to like Kentucky on the Bourbon Trail? Well, a bunch of people have. Well, it's pretty awesome. And I think Kentucky realized later on, much later, California jumped in very early with the wine industry, realizing, wow, if we team this together with tourism, people are going to come and they're going to try our products and so on. So you get places now like this brewery, which Brown Forman owns. This is the Woodward and Lathrop Brewery, distillery, which is where they make Woodford Reserve, so near Versailles, Kentucky. And it's a lovely, really it's a museum, even though they distill the bourbon there. But you see how Americans have really changed over time. I mean, how many people have, in recent memory, if somebody has a new apartment or a new house or someone, you've shown up with a nice bottle of wine, or some really good beer, or say a nice bourbon, a lot of people are nodding their heads, right? This is people have really started realizing, this is something that's kind of special and it's American made, and we take pride in this now. We don't need to drink pop vodka all the time, So this is something that we can take pride in, and more and more people are choosing here a lot more better products. All right, let's shift over and talk a little bit about the American drinking pattern. And we have sort of a weird way of teaching alcohol in our country and how to drink. Wisconsin, I know, is a little bit of an anomaly, because kids can go into bars with their parents, which most states you can't. Right? But across the board, what we see here from the federal government, this is how Americans drink. Because we don't really teach them at an early age that alcohol is a normal thing and it's something that you should drink responsibly. So as soon as, and most people take their first drink when they're 12 or 13, and by the end of high school, people start binge drinking. And then by the time they're actually legal, you can't see across there, but it's basically from 21 to 25, with that little red circle is cut off. That is really the peak binge drinking years. This is the newly legal adults who suddenly go, woo, it's legal now, let's get wasted, And they're introduced to this in college, right? You think about how many students, in particular, make sure they only have a 4-day college schedule. They take Friday off, and that way they have a 3-day weekend, because Thursday night's as they call it, it's Thursday day. So that's when a lot of heavy binge drinking takes place, starting Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, And then gradually you enter the workforce, and you realize, I can't be hungover on Friday. I actually have to be at work, So people then learn to moderate their drinking here, but it's kind of a terrible model we have. In Europe, it's far more normalized. Most kids, whether you're in Italy, whether you're introduced to wine, or Germany, whether they're introduced to beer, they learn it at the dinner table, that it's far more of a normal consumer product, and therefore not something that you need to abuse. And coincidentally as well here, talking about drunk driving, the high incidence of drunk driving coincides with the 21 to 25-year-olds, right? So you see very similarly, it really spikes, and then very quickly it comes down. So this is really the problem group, and it tends to be 21 to 25-year-old males. The other interesting thing here about drunk driving here, and this is a little bit wordy here, but talking about the problem of drunk driving, Mothers Against Drunk Driving was formed in 1984 for very legitimate reasons, right? Who here is in favor of drunk driving? No one is, right? This is a legitimate public health issue. And I think Matt, in fact, has done a service to the country by teaching us to be considerate, to think that, okay, if I'm going to go out tonight, how am I going to get home tonight, right? Am I going to team up with a couple other people and have a designated driver? Can I take a taxi to get back home? Or like here today, there'll be a shuttle bus, right? So people are far more aware of that now, right? That's good. On the downside, because of some of the issues dealing with drunk driving and lowering the blood alcohol concentration level, we've seen, in essence, a new stigma against drinking where people don't feel that they're able to drink much when they go out. And that has a big impact on your bottom line because people say, okay, I can only have one or two drinks and then, I can't have any more because, I might get arrested if I get pulled over and so on. The big problem with drunk driving really is the people who really truly are drunk. So in other words, 56% of the people who get killed on the road from drunk driving are people whose blood alcohol concentration is 0.15 or above. That's twice the legal limit, which is 0.08. Right? So it's not the people who've only had a couple of drinks. They're not the problem people on the road. It's the people who really are trashed and are getting behind the wheel. That's the real problem. And you'll see this. I'll show you a quick diagram. It displays it out here, the same information, but just simply a diagram. You see where the current legal EAC level is, 0.08, and then 0.15 across the bottom. That's where 56% or from there on, 56% of the deaths are by people who really are truly drunk and getting behind the wheel. So it's the problem, the people who are drunk behind the wheel are really the ones who are the problem, not the social drinkers who are just having a couple of beers here out with their friends. We are entering, I think everyone's probably heard this term here before, but the era of zero tolerance. And in fact, this is something that Mothers Against Drunk Driving really pushes. This is on the website, it's on the press materials. Their attitude is, we need to take care of the problem as soon as it happens, and therefore let's throw the book at someone. So as soon as they get pulled over and charged with the DUI, let's make sure this never happens again to that person, right? And so, hence the phrase zero tolerance. They want to create a social environment under which, if you get pulled over once, you're going to have major problems for yourself. There was an interesting case here that happened in my hometown. A woman named Deborah Bolton back in 2005, and I think this is kind of an interesting case study. In May of 2005, the night, by the way, before the Supreme Court ruled in Granholm versus Held, that was the interstate wine shipment case, this woman who was an attorney, Deborah Bolton, was pulling out of a parking garage. She'd gone out to dinner and had a glass of wine. And it was evening by that point. She pulled out of the garage and forgot to turn her headlights on. There was a policeman who saw her and pulled her over. The policeman then asked, "Have you been drinking?" She said, "Yes, officer, I had one glass of wine." And he arrested her. Took her to the station, put her on the breathalyzer, and she blew 0.03, well under the legal limit. He still charged her for the DUI because, as he said, DC had zero tolerance. In other words, I can charge you if you're anything above 0.000. And what was remarkable about this case was how the public responded to it. Everybody was scandalized by this. This made national headlines, And suddenly, out of the woodwork came all these consumers saying, hold on, wait a minute. You're saying I cannot have a single glass of wine with dinner or a beer? This woman didn't do anything wrong. All she did was have a glass of wine. She was responsible. She was well under the legal limit. And now you're going to stigmatize people for having any alcohol at all in their system. So at that point, because of this major public uproar, the DC City Council went back and they amended the law to say that, in fact, it is, as it was before, it's 0.08. They created a gray area from 0.05 to 0.08 where they could still arrest you. But the bargain was never 0.00, right? And yet that's how they were arresting people. So again, the public is interested in this fight, and it was remarkable to see how much people really stood up here because of something that suddenly impacted everyone, because almost everyone's a social drinker now, right? And if you're going to make 0.000 the de facto law, well then none of us can drink, right? And that's going to have a huge impact on the hospitality industry, and on all of us, if we're just simple drinkers, who like going to restaurants or bars. So yeah, I think the public is with you on this issue. They do get riled up here once in a while once they realize that their core interest, in fact, is at stake. So what does the future hold here? Let's look at the alcoholic beverage industry. The industry, by the way, is more than a $200 billion a year industry in the United States. So that's not chump change. It's a pretty significant industry and employs several million people here around the country. So it's one of our largest employers around the country. If you look around the world, what's going on here, the European Union has mandated now that most countries go down to 0.05. They used to be at 0.08, and the United States dropped down to 0.08 about a decade ago. They've now shifted down to 0.05, which means for most people, that means you can have one drink, that's it, right? It's having a huge impact on the hospitality industry. Even in big countries like France, which has a huge wine industry, in Germany, I was in Germany a year ago, and yeah, if you go to a wine tasting someplace, when you leave, expect to go into a breathalyzer. They're very serious about this now, about not letting you get behind the wheel after having a wine tasting. So kind of keep that in mind. And I wonder, Mothers Against Drunk Driving has never pushed this yet, but could they at some point decide, you know what, let's lower this down to 0.05, which will have a huge impact on everyone here in this room. That will largely mean one drink for everyone, if that. For some people, if you're, I'm a small person, it doesn't take very much to read before I feel it. I might not be able to drink anything at all, right? So, what else here? We've seen across the last few years, in the case of ignition interlock devices, really come to a head. We have 17 states now, including my home state, Virginia, is the latest state here that has mandated ignition interlock devices at first offense. First offense. So many states beforehand had required ignition interlocks at 0.15 or above. That's where most of the deaths occur. Thanks to Mothers Against Drunk Driving, they're now pushing this down to 0.08. So first offense. And you will now have to get an ignition interlock device in your car at your own expense, and then also funding the maintenance of that every single month here during your period. So it's Congress is also jumping in on this. In fact, this last summer they provided $20.8 million to the states to encourage them to promote ignition interlock programs here. So, I think most people are aware of what an ignition interlock device is. But yeah, MAD really wants to push this on to all 50 states here. They've been able to drive the drinking age down from 21 down to 18. They got VAC lowered from 0.10 down to 0.08. And now they're trying to push ignition interlock devices here for first offense for all 50 states. So you kind of see the writing on the wall how they're going to push this issue, right? And the last thing here is just, I think this is a bit of a trump card here, is technology. Where is technology heading? Well, technology is heading, I think within the next decade or so, the technology will be there whereby every car, in essence, has an interlock device here that's on the steering wheel, or it's part of the starter key. That when you put your hands on the steering wheel, it's going to know if you have alcohol in your system or not. Right? Technology is heading towards that direction, and the federal government, in fact, is pushing that. So is MAD. So, be aware where this thing is going here. There's the question then, okay, how can we influence this? Are they going to put in place 0.05, meaning one glass of wine and your car's not going to start, now you're stuck, right? Or is it going to be 0.15, So again, you need to speak up about this issue because it is coming, it is down the road, but it will be there. You're going to hear more and more about this issue because this is simply just where the technology is going. And technology, when everyone's got an iPhone now, right, or an Android device, this is just one of those things that's almost inevitable, right? But how the technology is implemented, that is not a given. It really depends on your voice and your speaking up here in the marketplace to your legislators and so on. I mentioned that here already. The question of, will it be the norm or not? Then ultimately here, what's the impact here of what the future might hold? Might we see in the United States, since many other countries are doing this, might we as well drop VAC for drinking and driving down to 0.05? That's a good question on my mind. And again, that will have a big impact here on the hospitality industry. So, what will be the impact here if every single state has to mandate ignition interlock devices here for first offense? I think most people are in favor of throwing the book at really, truly drunk drivers, because they are, in fact, a public health issue. But what about social drinkers, What about you and me who just has a glass of wine or two, or a beer or two? Social drinkers can really feel stigmatized because now you feel like you can't have very much drink, if anything at all, and therefore, gee, I won't have anything, Well, I may as well just stay at home and drink, and that doesn't help anyone, You miss out on friendships, you miss out on helping your neighborhood saloon, and so on. And again here, this era of zero tolerance and ignition interlocks and so on, how does this all feed into this sense of zero tolerance? The fact that, there's no tolerance here for social drinking. These are the big questions here I really wanted to raise up here to the audience. Because the outcome isn't given. It really isn't. Your say-so, your involvement here, for example, with the tavern ring is hugely important because they lobby on your behalf here for what actually gets legislated. So it's your voice here really does matter here in the state of Wisconsin and nationwide. And that's actually here my very last slide here. I did want to be able to open up the forum here to what questions that people might have. This is a quick little plug here for the two books I've written here about Prohibition. So The Prohibition Hangover and Prohibition in Washington, D.C. And those are both available on Amazon and also on the Kindle. I know a lot of people have Kindles now here for people who like to read. So I'll be glad to answer any questions that people might have. Yes, sir.
I was surprised that you didn't mention the Women's Christian Temperance Union, because although the Anti-Saloon League may be gone, the WCTU is still out there. And we may be 5,000 members statewide, but the WCTU nationwide is a 10,000-member organization.
Yeah, the question here was what about the Women's Christian Temperance Union? We talked about the Anti-Saloon League, which is ultimately the group that gave us Prohibition. WCTU, though, in its time, started back in 1873, 1874 in Ohio, had 600,000 members, which is pretty remarkable. Over time, though, and they helped because women did not have the vote until 1920. And by the way, the 18th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, those two things passed at the same time. So the 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. The 19th Amendment gave women the vote. Those things were not coincidental, by the way. Right? There was an alliance between the suffragettes and the anti-drinkers to get both these amendments passed at the same time. Once the 1920s hit, of course, then women beforehand had largely stayed at home and they didn't drink. But come the 1920s, when it's now illegal for everyone to drink, guess what? Women decide that they can equally break the law. So in the 1920s is really a fascinating era. Because you get consumer appliances, women have more free time, they can go out and start drinking and so on. And again, breaking laws just like men. The WCTU, unlike the ASL died in 1933. The WCTU is still around, but it's really literally dying off. I think it has nationwide fewer than 20,000 members, and it's not really a force like it once was. And people just don't respond to the message anymore of temperance. This idea that alcohol is sinful and that you shouldn't drink. I mean, it's really almost a fringe group here at this point. There's still some churches, especially the Pentecostal side and so on, that will still preach it. Southern Baptists still do. But, more and more Americans are choosing to drink. That's the question. Other questions? Yes, Pete.
I just want to comment. We just learned very recently, talking about ignition interlocks, there was a survey, a public survey done. There was a public survey done by the American Beverage Institute. And what that survey showed was that when asked if ignition interlocks should be put in all cars manufactured, 54% of the general public said yes, that is a great idea. But then, if you take that same 54% and you explain to them that because of malfunctions with ignition interlocks, just like your battery failing or your ignition failing, that there'd be 4,000 non-starts every day to the average person, would you still support ignition interlocks for all cars? That 54% goes down to 25%, which indicates that we have a huge job to do in educating the public about the ramifications of ignition interlocks, and that the ignition interlock itself is not the answer to all of the ills that Mad Mothers tries to put out there. So there are a couple of websites. One is interlockfacts.com. I really highly recommend that you go there and visit that website to educate yourself about the pros and cons of ignition interlocks, because as one of Garrett's slides demonstrated, the general public right now does not really think that ignition interlocks on all cars is a bad idea.
Additional questions? Tom says you're easy groups. Yes, sir.
I thought Mad Mothers was kind of going away. Where is like the new, I guess, the new group that's fighting the government?
Any other questions?
Well, I thought that Mad Mothers was kind of going away.
That's all right.
Mad Mothers was going away, and that a group called Aware was like a new proponent to the town.
I can answer that. Aware is a group that is based out of Madison, and they're very, very, very active here in Wisconsin. It's a health group. It's a bunch of antis out of Madison, Aware, and they are very active. MAD by no means is going away. What MAD does, it changes their voting. They find a different goal, a different issue to attack. They're getting into underage drinking now. Obviously, roadblocks is a big issue for MAD. Ignition interlocks is a big issue. MAD has morphed years ago to being an advocacy group that said don't drive drunk, to a group now that says don't drink and drive. And in the meantime, they have evolved into a multi-million-dollar corporation. A lot of people make a lot of money with about a $67 million a year budget. So MAD cannot afford to go away because there's too many people making too much money off it. So no, MAD is alive and well.
Yeah, MAD has 3 million members. I agree. Yeah, it's quite a large organization. So I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon.
Any other questions of Garrett? Yes, sir.
Do you see MAD and is Aware becoming the groups that led Prohibition back in the 20s?
Do I see them?
Becoming the people that were 100 years ago?
Gotcha. The question was, do we see Mothers Against Drink Driving becoming like the new anti-Salon movie that existed, 100 years ago? Their stated intent has never been to ban alcohol. Rather, I think they're trying to control the environment under which people can drink. So, probably most MAD members actually do drink, I think. But I don't think this is an organization that's actually trying to ban alcohol like the anti-Salon movie tried to, Rather, it's really about changing the environment.
I would argue that, I slightly disagree, I think they are. They are not going to, they know they cannot make alcohol illegal, but they want to make it something convenient. And the downside of having a drink so great that you will choose not to drink as because of the social stigma and the risk of it.
And certainly making it harder to drink outside of alcohol, which is huge. Another question?
Anything else for Garrett?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It's a really
Okay, while they're getting settled in up here, I want to introduce the Governmental Affairs Director, Scott Stinger.